August 13th, 1917. Office of the Port Engineer, Street Nazaire, Loire-Atlantique Department, France. Capitaine de Frégate Henry Leblanc of the French Navy's Port Engineering Service leaned back from his desk, the American blueprints spread before him, and removed his spectacles to rub his eyes. Leblanc had spent 32 years in port operations, from Brest to Marseille. He had overseen expansions at 3 French naval bases and written sections of the 1912 French Navy Port Operations Manual. When the Americans requested his professional assessment of their proposed expansion at Street Nazaire, he expected to offer constructive refinements to a reasonable plan. Instead, he found himself staring at what could only be described as industrial fantasy. The Americans proposed to construct 33 new deep-water berths where Street Nazaire currently operated 12. They planned to handle 350,000 tons of cargo monthly when the port's record stood at 45,000 tons. They estimated simultaneous operations for 40 vessels when French practice limited operations to 10 ships. Completion timeline, 12 months. Leblanc penned his assessment with professional precision. The proposed American construction program violates established principles of port engineering. Tidal limitations restrict berth construction. Labor requirements exceed available workforce. Proposed cargo handling rates assume equipment that does not exist. Professional assessment, technically impossible within stated timeframe. Revised estimate, 5 years minimum for partial implementation. What Capitaine Leblanc didn't know, what no French port engineer could have understood in August 1917, was that the Americans weren't planning to work within European port operation principles. They were planning to eliminate those principles entirely through industrial methods France had never applied to maritime logistics. French port engineering in 1917 represented centuries of accumulated maritime expertise. The major ports, Le Havre, Marseille, Bordeaux, had evolved gradually, each expansion carefully calculated against tidal patterns, available labor, and established cargo handling practices. The 1912 French Navy Port Operations Manual specified precise ratios: 1 berth per 8,000 tons monthly capacity, 1 steam crane per berth, minimum 48 hours berth time for cargo vessels over 3,000 tons. These weren't arbitrary rules. They represented professional understanding of physical limitations. Street Nazaire exemplified this careful methodology. The South Lock Gate, completed in 1907, represented 10 years of engineering work and 3.2 million francs investment. It added 4 berths, a significant achievement that increased annual throughput by approximately 80,000 tons. By 1917, Street Nazaire operated 12 deep-water berths, 14 warehouses, totaling 42,000 square meters and 23 rail sidings. The port employed 1,200 workers. Monthly throughput averaged 35,000 to 45,000 tons. This represented efficient operation of a medium-sized Atlantic port. When American engineers arrived in July 1917 with blueprints that called for 33 new berths, 165 electric cranes, 600,000 square meters of warehouses, and 60 kilometers of new rail track, by May 1918, French port authorities assumed this represented a 10-year development program. At a meeting on August 15, 1917, M. Jules Gautier, chief engineer of the Street Nazaire Port Authority, addressed the technical impossibilities. Berth construction along the Loire estuary faces tidal variation of 4.8 meters. Foundation work to bedrock through silt and clay substrate requires 6 months minimum per berth. 33 berths, 16 years construction time. The proposed cargo handling rate assumes 300 tons per berth per day. French ports achieve 120 tons, with experienced crews. Rail construction of 60 kilometers through urban areas requires extensive surveying and grading, 18 months minimum based on the 1857 Street Nazaire-Nantes connection. Contre-Amiral Jean Leproux of the French Atlantic Fleet summarized the consensus. The American officers are enthusiastic but inexperienced in European port operations. We recommend a revised program: 10 additional berths over 3 years, increasing Street Nazaire capacity to 75,000 tons monthly. This represents achievable expansion. The French weren't being obstructionist. Their skepticism rested on documented experience. Labor, Port operations required skilled workers trained over months. France's labor pool was depleted by 3 years of war. Where would 30,000 workers come from? Construction. The South Lock Gate required 10 years, including 3 years of foundation work alone. The Loire estuary substrate was notoriously difficult. Silt to 6 meters, clay below, bedrock at 18 to 20 meters. 33 berths in 12 months seemed mathematically impossible. Equipment. Steam cranes lifted 5 to 8 tons and required permanent steam lines. The Americans mentioned electric cranes of unspecified capacity. Such equipment didn't exist in French port operations. Where would they acquire 165 cranes? Tidal constraints. The Loire experienced tidal variation up to 5.2 meters. Large vessels could only navigate during high tide windows, creating natural bottlenecks. The Americans seemed to assume vessels could enter and depart at will. French engineers offered realistic alternatives: a 3-year expansion program with technical expertise and worker training assistance. What they wouldn't do was pretend the American 12-month program was achievable. Colonel Louis H. Pillard, commanding Base Section No. 1, thanked the French authorities. Then American construction crews arrived in September 1917, and the French discovered the Americans had no intention of revising anything. What French engineers failed to understand was that American military engineers weren't approaching Street Nazaire as a port expansion. They were approaching it as an industrial construction project, using methods developed building American railroads and factories. Major William Kelly, chief engineer for Base Section No. 1, had spent the previous decade building rail yards for the Great Northern Railway. Lieutenant Colonel Frank Morrison had overseen San Francisco port construction. Captain James Burke had managed Pennsylvania Railroad warehouse construction. These were industrial engineers who built infrastructure quickly using American methods. The American approach differed fundamentally from French practice. Prefabrication. Rather than building from locally acquired materials, Americans manufactured components in the United States: steel pilings, concrete caissons, crane components, rail sections, all shipped ready for installation. Parallel construction. Americans began 20 berths simultaneously in September 1917, accepting modification needs but gaining enormous time savings. Equipment over labor. Where French ports relied on skilled labor supplemented by equipment, Americans inverted the ratio. Equipment did heavy work. Workers guided and managed. 24-hour operations. French ports operated daylight hours. Americans installed electric lighting and operated continuously in 3 8-hour shifts. Construction began in September 1917. The first test: how would Americans handle foundation work through difficult substrate? They bypassed the problem entirely. Rather than excavating to bedrock, the French method, American engineers used steam-powered pile drivers to drive hollow steel pilings directly through silt and clay to bedrock. Each piling was 24 meters long, 60 centimeters diameter, fabricated in Pittsburgh, and shipped across the Atlantic. Pile drivers installed 15 pilings per day. Once pilings reached bedrock, concrete was poured into hollow interiors, creating rigid columns supporting prefabricated concrete decking. A berth requiring 6 months, using French excavation methods, was completed in 6 weeks. French engineers examined completed berths. The construction was crude by French standards, less elegant, more industrial. But the berths functioned, and they were built in 1/10 the time French methodology required. In October 1917, American labor battalions arrived. These units solved France's most critical objection: where would workers come from? The 17th, 20th, and 21st Engineer Service Battalions, African-American units commanded by white officers, provided the core workforce. Each battalion consisted of 1,250 men trained in heavy construction and cargo handling. By December 1917, 8 battalions operated at Street Nazaire, providing 10,000 workers. Additional labor came from American infantry units assigned to port operations pending deployment. The 26th Division contributed 3,500 soldiers in November. The 42nd Rainbow Division provided 4,200 men in December. The Americans systematized port operations into simple, repeatable tasks: A cargo hold traditionally required 12 skilled longshoremen supervised by an experienced stevedore master. The American system broke this into specialized roles. 4 men operated electric winches, 2 loaded nets to standard weights, 2 positioned loads, 2 operated cranes, 2 secured cargo. Each role required 3 to 5 days training. Efficiency came from systematic organization rather than individual expertise. By January 1918, Nazaire employed 28,000 workers, 22,000 American military personnel, and 6,000 French civilians, working continuous 24-hour shifts. In November 1917, the first American electric cranes arrived. French steam cranes lifted 5 to 8 tons, required permanent steam lines, operated slowly, and needed skilled operators. An experienced operator might handle 15 lifts per hour. American electric cranes lifted 20 tons, ran on portable generators, operated at variable speeds, and included mechanical limiters, preventing overload. A minimally trained operator could handle 30 lifts per hour safely because equipment enforced safety parameters. The cranes came from Browning Engineering of Cleveland, Ohio, Leland Crane Company of Buffalo, New York, and Morgan Manufacturing of Alliance, Ohio, companies that had developed heavy lifting equipment for American steel mills, where throughput demands exceeded European port experience. By March 1918, Nazaire operated 143 electric cranes, each manufactured in the United States, shipped in prefabricated sections, and assembled at the port. Total crane investment, $4.2 million, approximately 21 million francs, more than the entire construction cost of the 1907 South Lock Gate. Rail expansion proceeded simultaneously with berth construction. American railway engineer units laid track with systematic efficiency. They brought mechanical spike drivers, rail bending machines, portable concrete mixing stations, grading equipment. A 6-man team could lay 1 kilometer of track in 12 hours. By February 1918, American engineers had constructed 58 kilometers of new track, including direct rail sidings, to 26 berths, a marshalling yard with capacity for 800 rail cars, and connection loops, allowing continuous train operations. French rail officials noted American track construction was less refined than French practice, heavier rail sections, simpler grading, more aggressive curves. But it functioned, and it was built in 4 months rather than 4 years. October 15th, 1918, 2 p.m. Capitaine Leblanc stood at the port director's observation platform overlooking the Penhoet Basin at Colonel Pillard's invitation. He counted 42 vessels moored at American berths. 42! His professional training said this was impossible. You couldn't manage 40 ships simultaneously while maintaining safety and efficiency. The coordination requirements alone would create bottlenecks, but the ships were there, and cargo was moving. At berth 14, USS Westward discharged artillery shells using 4 electric cranes. At berth 19, SS Lake Filbert loaded aircraft fuselages. At berth 23, HMS Mantua offloaded 12,000 tons of coal. At berth 31, SS Ville de Lyon loaded American steel rails. Every berth showed activity. Cranes swung. Rail cars positioned and departed. Workers moved with systematic precision. Colonel Pillard provided October statistics. 186 vessels processed. 351,270 tons handled. Average berth time, 48 hours. Peak simultaneous vessels, 42 ships. Labor force, 28,400 workers. Tonnage per worker, 12.4 tons, compared to French standard of 7.3 tons. Nazaire was handling 350,000 tons monthly, the target French engineers had called technically impossible. The Americans were exceeding it consistently. In following weeks, French engineers studied American operations. The French Navy's Port Operations Review, November 1918. American port operations at Nazaire achieved throughput rates 2.8 times French port averages through systematic organization, equipment substitution for labor, and continuous operations. Traditional French methodology emphasizes skilled labor performing complex integrated tasks, American methodology emphasizes simplified tasks performed by minimally trained workers using equipment that enforces efficiency. Neither approach is inherently superior. French methodology produces elegant operations with minimal equipment investment. American methodology produces high throughput at substantial equipment cost. The critical observation is that American methods achieve results we calculated impossible because they eliminate constraints we considered fundamental. Professional assessment. American port operations represent industrial transformation of maritime logistics. This was extraordinary professional recognition. The French Navy's authoritative port engineering publication was admitting American methods achieve results we calculated impossible. Final statistics for Street Nazaire's American operations, compiled after November 1918 armistice. Construction. September 1917 to May 1918. 33 deepwater berths constructed, 165 electric cranes installed, 483,000 square meters of warehouses, 64 kilometers of rail track, electrical capacity, 8,400 kilowatts, worker housing, 32,000 beds. Total cost, $67.3 million, approximately 336 million francs. The 1907 South Lock Gate cost 3.2 million francs. The Americans spent 105 times as much and completed construction in 8 months. Operations, June 1918 to November 1918. Monthly average, 347,600 tons. Peak monthly, 412,000 tons. October 1918. Total ships, 1,164 vessels. Total cargo, 2,088,400 tons. Average berth time, 2.1 days. Maximum simultaneous, 42 ships, October 13th. Comparison. French projection for Street Nazaire by mid-19, 75,000 tons monthly. American achievement, June 1918, 350,000 tons monthly. American performance exceeded French projections by 467%. French authorities conducted extensive reviews. General Henri Mordac, Chief of Staff of the French Army, wrote in 1920 memoirs, American logistics capabilities exceeded even optimistic estimates. Their port operations at Street Nazaire demonstrated industrial methods we had not imagined applicable to maritime operations. They achieved in months what French engineering practice suggested would require years, not through superior theoretical knowledge, but through systematic organization and willingness to apply industrial manufacturing methods. M. Jules Gaultier, who had authored the French objections in August 1917, published a remarkably candid assessment in January 1920, Revue Maritime. In August 1917, I assessed American expansion proposals as technically impossible based on 30 years of professional expertise. The Americans proved this assessment wrong, not by solving the problems we identified, but by making those problems irrelevant. Where we saw tidal limitations, they built pile-driven berths, functional at all tides. Where we saw labor shortages, they brought 30,000 workers from America. Where we saw equipment constraints, they manufactured and shipped 165 cranes. Where we saw construction timelines determined by concrete curing, they used prefabricated components and parallel construction. The fundamental error was assuming American engineers would work within European port operation constraints. They did not. They eliminated constraints through industrial methods. This represents a transformation in port engineering methodology with significant implications. This was extraordinary. Gaultier was admitting in France's premier engineering journal that French expertise had been inadequate for evaluating American methods because it was bounded by European experience. Street Nazaire wasn't unique. At Bordeaux, Brest, and La Pallice, French authorities initially assessed American plans as impractical. At each port, Americans proceeded with industrial construction. At each port, they exceeded French projections. Total American port throughput in France, October 1918, 847,000 tons, exceeding total French Atlantic port capacity combined from 1914. The Americans had effectively doubled France's Atlantic port capacity in 12 months. American methods influenced post-war European port development. Rotterdam's 1925 expansion referenced street Nazaire methods. Hamburg's post-World War II reconstruction incorporated American cargo handling techniques. Liverpool's 1930s modernization adopted American electric cranes and continuous operations. American achievement at street Nazaire rested on key factors. Industrial scale. Americans applied industrial capacity that European ports had never brought to maritime logistics. They manufactured equipment, built facilities, and organized operations using factory methods. Systematic organization. Every operation was analyzed and optimized. Work was broken into simple tasks. Efficiency came from organization rather than individual skill. Capital investment. $67.3 million bought equipment, prefabricated components, and infrastructure that eliminated traditional constraints. Labor mobilization. 28,000 workers solved labor constraints not through French labor markets, but by importing American military personnel. Bypassing constraints. French engineers worked within constraints. Americans eliminated constraints through different methodology, backed by enormous resources. Statistics obscure human experience. The 28,000 workers operated under difficult conditions. African American labor battalions, providing most construction workforce, faced both wartime dangers and era racism. Housed in segregated camps, paid less than white soldiers, they received minimal recognition, yet they performed efficiently. The 17th Engineer Service Battalion set Army records for rail construction speed. The 20th Battalion built 17 berths in 5 months. French civilians experienced their town's transformation from quiet port to frenetic military-industrial operation. Housing was scarce, prices inflated, daily life became chaotic, yet most residents supported American operations. American soldiers assigned to port operations experienced unglamorous but essential logistics work, building berths, operating cranes, loading rail cars, generating no metals but making offensives possible. When Americans departed Street Nazaire in 1919, they left transformed infrastructure. Total cargo handled, June 1917 to April 1919, 3,847,000 tons. Total ships processed, 2,164 vessels. Total troops embarked, disembarked, 197,300 soldiers. American berths, warehouses, and rail facilities remained. French authorities incorporated American facilities into permanent infrastructure. Street Nazaire's cargo capacity had permanently increased, approximately 400%. The broader lesson. American operations demonstrated that World War I had transformed logistics as fundamentally as combat. Industrial methods, systematic organization, and massive capital investment could overcome traditional constraints. Port operations, like warfare itself, had entered the industrial age. In December 1919, Capitaine Henri Leblanc published his final professional assessment in Revue Maritime, titled American Port Operations, Professional Lessons from Street Nazaire. He wrote, in August 1917, I assessed American expansion proposals as technically impossible based on 32 years of professional experience. The Americans proceeded despite French objections. They completed construction in 8 months, rather than our 5-year estimate. They achieved 350,000 tons monthly versus our 75,000-ton projection. They operated 42 ships simultaneously when we calculated 10 maximum. The critical question isn't whether French assessment was wrong. It clearly was. The question is why. French port engineering evolved over centuries of maritime commerce. Our methods were refined, efficient, elegant, representing accumulated professional wisdom. American methods were none of these. Their berths were crude. Their organization was mechanical. Yet they achieved results we declared impossible. They succeeded because they asked different questions. We asked how to optimize port operations within known constraints. They asked how to eliminate constraints. We sought to improve efficiency of skilled labor. They sought to replace labor with equipment. We planned careful sequential construction. They executed parallel construction, accepting higher risk. This represents more than different methodology. It represents different epistemology, different understanding of how to approach engineering problems. European tradition emphasizes working within constraints through elegant optimization. American industrial tradition emphasizes eliminating constraints through capital investment and systematic organization. For French port engineering, Street Nazaire demonstrates we must reconsider fundamental assumptions about port capacity, construction timelines, and operational limitations. Constraints we considered physical may be methodological. Limitations we considered absolute may be conventional. Professional humility requires acknowledging when expertise has been superseded by new methodologies. Street Nazaire represents that moment for European port engineering. Leblanc's assessment revealed something profound about the nature of expertise itself. French engineers hadn't failed through incompetence or laziness. They had failed because their expertise was so thorough, so refined, so deeply grounded in centuries of experience that it had become a prison of assumptions. Every calculation they made was correct within their framework. Every limitation they identified was real within their methodology. Every impossibility they declared was genuine within their epistemology. The Americans didn't possess superior engineering knowledge. What they possessed was industrial naivety, the dangerous freedom of not knowing what was supposed to be impossible. They approached port operations the same way they approached automobile manufacturing or steel production, as problems of throughput, standardization, and capital equipment, rather than skilled labor and traditional craft. Where French engineers saw a port as a refined system requiring expert coordination of skilled workers, American engineers saw an assembly line that happened to be outdoors and involved ships. They applied factory logic to maritime operations. They brought mass production thinking to an industry that had evolved through centuries of maritime tradition. They treated longshoremen not as skilled craftsmen, but as machine operators who could be trained in days rather than years. This wasn't simply about American confidence or French pessimism. It was about two fundamentally different conceptions of what engineering problems were and how they should be solved. French methodology asked, "Given our constraints, what's the optimal solution?" American methodology asked, "What if we eliminated the constraints?" French engineers calculated what was possible with available resources. American engineers decided what was necessary and then created the resources to achieve it. The implications extended far beyond Street Nazaire. Throughout the war, similar patterns emerged. American shipbuilding programs that violated traditional construction timelines, manufacturing systems that produced weapons at rates European arsenals considered impossible, training programs that created functional soldiers in weeks rather than the years European doctrine demanded. This concluded French professional discussion of Street Nazaire, a remarkable document where a senior French engineer admitted French professional consensus had been fundamentally wrong, not through incompetence, but through limitations of conventional expertise. The broader lesson extended beyond ports to World War I's nature itself. This was the war where industrial capacity trumped military doctrine, where manufacturing determined outcomes more than battlefield courage, where systematic organization proved more decisive than tactical brilliance. At Street Nazaire, French engineers with centuries of maritime expertise declared American plans impossible. 18 months later, they watched 42 ships being loaded simultaneously, cargo flowing at rates violating every traditional calculation, a port operating at throughput levels French methodology suggested were theoretical maximums. The Fantasy Port had become Europe's highest capacity military logistics facility. The impossible plans had produced results exceeding even American projections. Professional certainty that American proposals violated fundamental engineering principles had collided with industrial reality that eliminated those principles. Capitaine Leblanc had been right about one thing. American proposals of August 1917 were fantasy by European port engineering standards. What he hadn't understood was that American industrial methods could make fantasy operational reality. Street Nazaire proved that in modern industrial warfare, enough capital, enough organization, and enough audacity could overcome expert consensus about what was technically possible. The French engineers who called American plans fantasy weren't wrong based on their expertise. They were simply applying expertise bounded by European experience to American industrial methods that exceeded that experience. The ships at Street Nazaire's American berths were real. The 350,000 tons monthly were real. The 42 simultaneous vessels were real. The fantasy had become industrial fact through methods French expertise hadn't imagined applicable to port operations. And that, ultimately, was the lesson of Street. Nazaire. Expert professional certainty about technical limitations may be less certain than it appears when confronted with industrial methods that eliminate rather than work within those limitations.